Thank you. All right. Thanks, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. Just want to say that the talk this afternoon is mainly based on this book that Christian mentioned. I just finished co-authoring a book on that tries to, the title here is Bringing Art Back into History, as if there ever had been a moment when they were totally combined. That's probably presumptuous. The reality is that the academic world we live in is one in which art history and history are separated by some kind of marginal line, some kind of apartheid wall. We're not just here, but any university, these are different departments, if not housed in different colleges. And so the effort that I'm making with my co-author, who's a real art historian, is exactly to address this question of how we can use art to inform history and history to inform art. And so what I'm doing here is part of that project. And I'm focusing on Indo-Islamic history because that's what I am most interested in. And I'm raising these two questions that Christian already mentioned. I want to talk about how art can tell us something about migration patterns. And the year 1221 is not coincidental. That's when Genghis Khan invades and sacks famous cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Balkh, and gets all the way to the Indus River, thereby driving hundreds of thousands, or beginning a pattern of driving hundreds of thousands of Turks, Persianized Turks, into North India seeking refuge. So there's a whole story there about that migration corridor. And the other question I want to raise is how art and architecture can reflect issues of politics within the ruling class, and especially how it reveals social, cultural divisions within the class. And yes, memory. Yes, this is for Susan. I'm very much interested in how memory informs architecture as well as politics. And in this particular context, I'm using memory, or looking at how memory informs state identity. So with all that, I want to start with my personal nemesis. Sam Huntington wrote this awful book in 1996, which happened to come out just several years before 9/11, and therefore it seemed to explain the world as it actually is to many people who should have known better. And in that book, he includes this unbelievable map, which I just want you to meditate on for a few moments for a couple of reasons. First of all, notice how he mixes categories. This is not a map just concerning religions alone. It also has languages in there. It also has a few nation states, and it even has a semi-continent. So this is not just mixing apples and oranges. This is apples, oranges, pomegranates, grapefruit, and mangoes. So that's part of the problem. It is, from a categorical standpoint, it is completely nonsensical, absurd. But for another reason, it's also extremely problematic, and that is that it has the tendency to ethnically cleanse territory. It's basically a projection of civilization onto territory, which is always a dangerous enterprise, I would argue. You would never know from this map that there are more Muslims in India than the entire Middle East, for example. Nor can you tell any of the kind of gradations or of multicultural communities that exist. One of my favorites is the fact that you can go just 45 miles from here, Tucson, and you will leave the world of Christendom and enter Latin America. So, Sam Huntington, and I want to come back to him because this is part of what I think art can do. I'm going to talk briefly about migration. I mentioned Genghis Khan, and what you have here is a map of India reflecting something of the major migration corridors that came into being after the Mongols' first attack. And the Mongols Genghis Khan just didn't come, 1221 and take off and leave forever. The Mongols made repeated raids on India for the next century and a half, almost every decade. They never conquered North India, but they drove hundreds of thousands of Iranians, Turks, Persianized Turks, into the Delhi Sultanate, which was established fortuitously just a couple of decades before the Mongols began. In 1206, the Delhi Sultanate is established, and the map you see here is the dark area indicates the part of India that was under Delhi Sultanate rule in the time of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, which is kind of the height of Sultanate rule. And as you can see from the map, the corridor takes you straight from Lahore, south and east, down to Delhi, then all the way down the Gangetic Plain, and also through Rajasthan to Gujarat and the Arabian Sea, and from there into the Deccan Plateau. You can trace this migration pattern, I'm going to argue, by looking at the kind of architectural vocabulary that emerges in prominent monuments built by Indo-Muslims in the post-13th century period. I'm going to start in Lahore, one of the most famous monuments in the Muslim world, in the Indian world certainly, the Congregational Mosque built in the late 17th century. But it illustrates all the things I want to talk about. I mean, the kind of figures, it's got the open court, the huge open courtyard, the frontal screen you see there, central dome, engaged minarets, pointed arches, and a multi-bayed prayer hall. So this is kind of the prototype. And we can go from Lahore down to Delhi. And in Delhi, oh, that's terrific. Thanks. This is not a mosque, it's a tomb, hence there's no minarets. But you'll notice it has many of the same features I just pointed out a few moments ago. This is the tomb of Humayun, the second Mughal emperor. And we can go from Delhi down to Agra, where you will find a somewhat well-known monument. Although it is a tomb, it does have minarets, apparently for aesthetic purposes, but it has all the other basic features that we associate with this larger migration pattern. We continue down the Gangetic Plain, and also going back earlier in time to Jaunpur, where we find in the early 15th century this congregational mosque. It's got the open courtyard. It's got here a very prominent screen in front of a dome, which you can barely see, but it's there. Pointed arches, all the rest of it continue. So we're clearly seeing variations on a theme. Going back to Delhi, we can also head southwest to Ahmedabad in Gujarat. Another successor states that when the Tughlaqs folded up and they were followed by independent sultanates, as in Jaunpur, also in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, we have a sultanate in early 15th century building this extraordinary monument, which continues to have basically the same kind of architectural vocabulary that we've already become familiar with. If we continue down the corridor, the trade routes along the western Deccan Plateau, into the Deccan Plateau to Dowlatabad, which was actually for some time the co-capital of the Sultanate in the time of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. We find there its congregational mosque, large open courtyard in the front, no screen, but a central dome, pointed arches. It's got minarets on the side, engaged minarets, and the rest of it. So we've come to see here then and then one more. Moving down to Bijapur, in the 16th century, we get this extraordinary mosque, different from all the others in some respects, but again, repeating most of the same vocabulary we've already seen. So we have, although we've covered several centuries and thousands of miles of space, you can see that there is a common kind of family of characteristics that are found in these monuments. Now, fasten your seatbelts. We are going to go to Bengal. And here we have not a mosque, but a temple. And you might say, well, that's the reason. Well, it's got a lot of things in terms of the origins of well, let me just point the major features that are particularly unique, I would argue unique to Bengal. One is the curved cornice. You're going to find monuments all over Bengal with a curved cornice. And the other is the kind of square, the squares that you find in the surface of the wall that are formed by these ribs, both vertical and horizontal. The origin of this kind of monument, even though there's a temple in this case, is quite clearly this, the kind of vernacular vocabulary of village huts. In fact, our word bungalow comes from the word Bangala, which means the Bengal style of dwelling, which in its crudest, simplest form is right here. The prominent features being, once again, the curved cornice. Now, this was not designed by any architect. It's made that way by the natural, you got so much rain in Bengal, it's a thatched roof, that the rain just is going to flow off the sides. And the walls are made of bamboo ribs, both vertical and horizontal. And they're done in such a way you can see they kind of form squares in the front. So these two features, the curved cornice, and the walls, the surface of the walls being squared with ribs, is something that is repeated now in other temples of Bengal, such as the Shyama Raya temple. In Bishnupur, same kind of thing. You see it stare you in the face. In another one, the Madan Mohan temple. I can go through lots of these, but I think that's you got the point. We look more closely, we can see how these square zones are filled in, and we look very closely, and we can see that there are figures in them. Still closer, we can see that they're used for narrative reliefs. This is all terracotta, by the way. Bengal does not have stone, so your only choice, it's just a big muddy delta after all. So everything is basically terracotta construction. Stone is very rare. It's only used for structural purposes when you really have to hold up things. So these are terracotta. They're images from Hindu stories, which people could read, visually read. And now we come to a mosque. And lo and behold, what do we find? We find a curved cornice, and we find the same motif of square, which is exactly, of course, what we found in the original bungalow, that hut that I spoke of a moment ago. And we can look at the same monument from different angles, or other monuments, which give us something of the same sense. True, there are engaged minarets, although they're not actual minarets, because they're not served for calling the prayer. And there are domes. But apart from that, we have the same kind of surface that I described that you already saw in the temples, except that when we look more closely, we don't see human figures. There's no Hindu narratives going on here, but there are abstract designs, floral designs, geometric designs that are human-like almost, but not quite. It's kind of a simulation of something getting really close, dangerously close to human figures, but they aren't actually human figures. We look closely, more closely, we see, of course, the one symbol that is found on all monuments in India, regardless of religion, and that is the lotus, because the lotus symbolizes the triumph of life over mud. That's what it is. It grows out of mud. So we find them everywhere. And even below the inscription, you find again these human-like motifs, as if they're replicating the same kind of thing, aesthetic vision that you would find in a contemporary temple. So here we have, again, the Hindu temple with its curved cornice and squared off surface. And here we have the mosque, both of them built in the same 17th century. The temple, the mosque. Okay, that's one point. Now we're going to leave Bengal momentarily and travel over to Kerala. Totally different environment culturally. But one thing it shares in common with Bengal is very high rainfall. So they also have a rain problem, and their monuments are going to be concerned with keeping the rain out. But they solve that problem in a very different way. Here you have tiled roofs, actually mission tile, just like on the U of A campus, with multi floors and roofs, either cantilevered or more frequently bracketed. That's what you have. Wooden brackets is what you have here. And we look at their temples. And we can see here, the stone walls, but the wooden brackets and the mission tile roof repeated in all over the coast of Malabar, which is modern Kerala. But it's not just religious architecture, it's also, in this case, royal architecture. The Palace of Travancore, this one back to 18th century, repeats the same theme. Gables, lots of gables, lots of roofs, lots of overhanging eaves supported by brackets. And domestic architecture, same thing. We're looking at a absolutely well-to-do house, but the same architectural vocabulary with the brackets, the wooden brackets, the mission tile roof. And now we go to Islam, and behold, here is our mosque in Malabar, where you have essentially the identical features that are being replicated. This is in Calicut. The Miscal Mosque, it's been rebuilt many times, but the original frame goes back to the 16th century. And you can see, looking at it, this is looking at the same mosque from a different perspective, with its multiple roofs, mission tile, surface, wooden brackets, and all the rest of it, that we have the same kind of vocabulary in mind. So here's our temple, here's our mosque, and here's our question. Can we speak of Islamic architecture with a straight face? I mean, I know we teach courses where we always have about, this is Hindu architecture, this is Muslim architecture. Well, I want to suggest to you that at least if we're looking at Bengal or Kerala, and I could have extended the argument with Kashmir, I don't want to have time for that. Clearly, these categories don't work. And I want to suggest that while we can use architecture to trace migration and the limits of migration, we can also use architectural data like this to challenge categories that many of us at least, have been accustomed to assume is part of the world order. And clearly, I think one can distinguish between those monuments which lie along this kind of spine, if you will, of a migration corridor starting up in the Khyber Pass in northwest frontier and then extending southeast and south. A second theme that I think one can find in looking at architecture in India is how it reflected very significant divides within the Muslim ruling class in various parts of India. And I'm going to focus on the south, because that's the part that I've been studying most recently, although Bengal was an earlier fixation. And I want to suggest that one of the features of really starting in the 15th century and going through the 16th and the 17th century was a very severe social cultural division between two camps of ruling Muslims. The so-called Westerners, and I use the word Westerner because that's the literal translation of Gharbian. That's because these are people who came from the West. The West does not mean Europe. The West here means Iraq, the Persian Gulf, Iran, even Central Asia, but many of them by overseas. And the Decchanese refer to those descendants of earlier migrants who had come, actually many of them from back in the 13th century when the Mongols first arrived and drove those Turks into North India. Many of them kept on just moving into the south. And their descendants became rooted in the soil and had a very different kind of perception of themselves as opposed to the Westerners. The Westerners tended to be, as it were, looking over their shoulder to Central Asia. This monument here is the famous madrasa of Mahmud Gawan. Now, Mahmud Gawan was an immigrant from the Caspian area, northern Iran, in Gilan, to be exact. He got driven out of his home area in Iran by local politics and became a horse merchant. And he eventually ends up in India. And he finds patronage with the Bahmani Sultanate in South India. And he rises to become the prime minister. Very, very, very renowned prime minister. He tried to attract other people from Iran to the Sultanate, and he patronizes the building of this extraordinary monument. Now, if you look at this madrasa, we're back in the architectural vocabulary of Timurid Central Asia. You have the colored tile, yellow, blue, and green, the rather austere form of this part of the madrasa. We don't have, the whole thing is not in view because there was an earthquake and half of it got wiped out. But just from this, you can see, and you can make comparisons with other madrasas in contemporary Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, cities we know that Mahmud Gawan had visited before coming to India. To nail down the case that his focus was on the Middle East, I actually went through the Riyaz al-Shah, which is a collection of his correspondence. And these are letters that he wrote from Bidar to anyone. And you can see most of them were sent out to Iran and Anatolia and even Cairo. He was in personal touch with the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, the Mamluk sultans, the various kings, various shahs on the Iranian plateau, obviously Gilan, his hometown. He's in touch with Samarkand. He's got a big business operation. His sons are importing cannon from the Mamluks, and they're exporting textiles into the Mamluk and Ottoman domain. Apart from a few letters to Jaunpur and Dhar, his focus is in the West. And my point there is that when we look at someone like him, we can see architecturally where he's coming from very clearly. He's looking over his shoulder to Samarkand, to Timurid Central Asia. But the Deccans have a very different take on, well, their aesthetic vision is very different. And for them, it's the memory of earlier empires which is significant. Let me just kind of run through with this map here what I'm trying to say. In the 16th century, you have a severe military kind of frontier between the great state of Vijayanagara in the south with this monstrous metropolis. Portuguese merchants who came straight from Lisbon to Vijayanagara described the city as larger than any city in Europe. This would be the early 16th century. Huge metropolis area that was eventually destroyed in the late 16th century. They're always at war with all these sultanates to the north, but especially Bijapur, because they have the most territory they're directly confronting them here. And this contested zone is in between. So this is a frontier separating two states that are in constant war. And if we read kind of British classical Orientalist literature about this period of history, it always is interpreted as a conflict between Hindu Vijayanagara and Muslim Bijapur. Again, we're locked into these categories, the same ones that I was trying to deconstruct with in the case of Kerala and Bengal. Well, if we look at actually what these people were doing architecturally, never mind in other respects, a very different story emerges. I go back to my good friend Sam Huntington, because again, you know, I had this constant dialogue with this guy because this map really says it all. You know, in his view, all of India is one, you know, monochromatic, single civilization. And when we're looking at architecture and the kinds of themes that I want to explore, that clearly falls apart. And we really see it in the case of what I'm about to say here. The Chalukya Empire is one of the great unsung empires in Indian history. Hardly anyone writes about this. Even Indian textbooks almost ignore this magnificent empire, which I've really kind of, one of my agendas is to kind of bring this empire back to life. It had 2 centuries of glory, a millennium ago, roughly 975 to 1175, and covered virtually the entire Deccan Plateau. Their great enemies were the Cholas, these 2 superpowers in the Deccan, the Chola dynasty of the south. Now the Cholas, unfortunately, have sucked all the oxygen out of scholarship, in my view, largely because they are the ones who make these beautiful bronze dancing Shivas. You've all seen them. these statuettes. They're famous. And they have spectacular temples in Madras, which is very easy to get to because Madras is a colonial capital, and they're right there, and you get off the airplane, you're going to see them. And they also have gazillions of inscriptions, so that we know a lot about them because they were very prolific. So there's a lot of scholarship of the Cholas, almost nothing on the Chalukyas. And yet it was the Chalukyas who were revived, consciously revived, 500 years later in a variety of ways, not the Cholas. And I want to just say a few words about the Chalukyas, a good word for the Chalukyas, just to say something about their own spectacular architectural and sculptural accomplishment. This is just one of hundreds of temples they built. Very refined monuments. This is a stele out here, by the way, inscription, both Sanskrit and Kannada, so that everyone kind of can understand who the Chalukyas were. The memory of the Chalukyas remained alive, largely because they themselves put these big steles out in front of the temples to tell you who they were and what they were doing. This is a temple that I was so obsessed with, I made a special trip 500 miles from Delhi down to from Bangalore, then to Bankapur, way out in the back of beyond, to see this monument. And I'll tell you why in a moment. This is just to give you an example of the kind of refined sensibility that the Chalukya architects had. The same monument from the front. This is one of the kind of fabulous crocodiles that emerges again and again in Chalukya sculpture. You see these all over the place. This particular one, yeah. And this is the interior of that same hallway you saw a moment ago, just to give you a flavor of the spectacular level of craftsmanship in making these columns, each of them different. They're all trophy columns, very highly polished, almost as if they've been turned on a lathe. And here's another part of that same temple, just to give you a flavor of the interior. And this is something of the sculpture work. These are very different styles. The one on the left is northern style, different kind of stone, not as softer. This is a harder stone in the southern part of the Carnatic, which enables you to have freestanding statues. The others are always engaged in a monument. But these things are lying all around. You have sculpture, you have temples, you have stele. The memory of the Chalukyas was certainly around in the 16th century, even though politically they'd been wiped off the map 4 centuries earlier. And the point I want to come to, I mean, here's the punchline right away. Both Muslim, quotation quote, Muslim Bijapur and Hindu Vijayanagara are actively engaged in reviving the memory of the Chalukyas in the 16th century. And I want to just kind of show how that happens. For Vijayanagara to the south, what they do is they literally take a Chalukya tank, which is what you see here, and move it stone by stone from some site that no one knows where it originally was, to the very heart of Vijayanagara. Vijayanagara, this huge metropolitan city, and right in the royal center, not down where the river is, where all the big Hindu temples are, which is the religious center, but in the royal center, where all the ceremonies dealing with kingly behavior and royal institutions, they occur here. The consecration of kings, the bathing of kings, and the royalty, all that would have occurred in this tank. And the tank was, and by the way, Phil and I discovered the fact that this whole thing was not built in situ. It was transported. It was dismantled. Each stone was numbered in such a way that the masons would know exactly how to rebuild it when they did so in the middle of this royal center. And it was done at a time when the Vijayanagara Empire was going down the drain, and the throne had been usurped by someone not of royal blood. So he had his genealogists connect him with the Chalukyas 500 years earlier. What else does he do? He dismantles this tank and plants it right in the middle of the royal center. So he is kind of a neo-Chalukya, if you will. This is Ramaraya, an extraordinary figure. I could talk more about him, but I can't. right now. But the point is that there are political as well as cultural reasons why it is that this dynasty is concerned with reviving the memory of the Chalukyas. To the north, in Bijapur, they're arch rivals. I mean, Vijayanagara was at war with Bijapur for over a century. Here's their citadel. This is the moat, and then and this is the great Gagan Mahal. What's left of it, I should say, one of the largest spans in the arch, by the way, anywhere in India, is right here. It's a huge, huge, huge thing. Audience hall. This is a plan of the citadel of Bijapur. Number 8 up there at the top is what you just saw, the audience hall. In the south down here is the only gateway leading into the citadel. And I'm going to focus on this gateway because this is the kind of ceremonial center of the entire kingdom. This is where royal dignitaries, visitors would come in, processions would lead through here. This is literally the entrance into the heart of the kingdom. And we look more closely, it's done in conventional military architecture of the age. You've got a series of barbicans and courtyards. You start out here in the outermost gate, you go through here, you've got to pass through guard houses, you go to another gateway, another courtyard, then you go to the final one, which is where the arrow is, takes you into the inner courtyard. Now the inner courtyard is the most politically charged area of the entire citadel. Why? Because that takes you directly, that means you've made it from the outside world, you're now in the interior of the citadel, and you're going to go to the Sultan's palace. So here we are in the outer barbican, the outer gateway. Very conventional, pointed arch, no surprises here. We're going to go inside, and we get in the inside. Now, this particular photograph is taken in 1956. We're in the inside of the citadel, looking out toward the entrance into the inner courtyard. This is the inner courtyard. And what you see in the inner courtyard is a forest of Chalukya columns. All of them are trophy columns, which have been brought in from somewhere and planted there, kind of put on display, so that the visitor or dignitary or whoever it is, that's what you see as you're coming into the citadel. Here's a close-up or closer-up figure. Now, the reason I'm showing you this earlier picture is because half of these are knocked down today, so you can't really see them as they were. But originally there were 12 on each side. It was an all-symmetrical arrangement of 24 columns, 12 in the south, 12 in the north. What you see today are just a handful of them, but you can see, if you look closely, these are obviously spectacular Chalukya, examples of Chalukya columns. Here's another shot of those, standing from the gateway. Here's a close-up of one of them, finely carved. Another one still over here. As I said, there were 24. This is a photograph of the gateway to the citadel with some of those columns on the far left, the original ones. But what I want to point to is this blank area just to the left of there, because what there used to be in the 19th century, it was documented, and it was suddenly missing in the early 20th century, was an inscription. Ibrahim Adil Shah, the third sultan of the dynasty, planted in this very significant part of the citadel an actual inscription, a Sanskrit inscription of Someshvara II. Someshvara II was one of the most important emperors of the Chalukya dynasty. And what he's doing in this inscription is declaring that he is basically patronizing the building of a temple to Shiva in the city of Vijayapura, which is later corrupted to Bijapur. There's a connection with Bankapur, because the order is coming from Bankapur. Now I want to come back to Bankapur, because what's happening in this inscription is the Sultan is making a clear reference to another Chalukya city and tying it, Bankapur, with this city, Bijapur, or Vijayapura. This is written in clear Kannada, so that anyone can read it, even now, if the inscription were still there, that is. But it's all described at the time. Now, Ali Adil Shah It's remarkable. He's the successor to, he's the next sultan after Ibrahim, who built the Chalukya columns you just saw. He also patronizes Chalukya art, but in memory in a very different way. First of all, we've just discovered in the last couple of years that he is the author of this extraordinary text, the Nujum al-Ulum, the knowledge of the stars. And it's really a study of how knowledge of astrology is connected to power on Earth. But what it does, he draws on both Hindu and Islamic and pre-Islamic Persian and Greek. He's very eclectic in what he's doing here. And he has these extraordinary images. It's a well-illustrated manuscript, which kind of merges Persian with classical Indian ideology, and it's written in Persian, but highly Hinduized, or it's in really Deccan Persian mixed. He, in 1568, sponsors the building of a postern. Now, a postern is a small gateway. It's in the south side of the outer wall of Bijapur, which Ali also built. He has this inscription on it, which is simply telling us that it was built by a Hindu, by the way. This guy, Pundit, down here, builds this postern in the reign of Ali Adil Shah. And if you look closely at what's below the inscription is a torana. It's called a Makara torana. It's taken from a Chalukya temple. And the figures on the right and left, if you look closely again, is the same kind of fabulous crocodile that was the signature of Chalukya art. So now we have another significant bit of Chalukya art planted right in the part of the outer wall that corresponds to the same part of the inner wall, the citadel, where Ibrahim had planted those Chalukya pillars. Right. This map here simply shows the correspondence between where the Chalukya art appears in the outer wall in relation to where the pillars appeared in the inner wall. I mentioned Bankapur. I mentioned that because the inscription that Ibrahim planted into the inner, courtyard mentions the fact that it was from Bankapur that the Shiva temple was ordered to be built in Bijapur. So I went to Bankapur, and not only did I go there, but before I went there, Ali Adil Shah went there in the 1570s, I think it was, 60s, sometime before I got there, in fact. The texts, there's several Persian texts that talk about what happened. What he's doing is, having defeated Vijayanagara, Bijapur is now gobbling up territory to its south. So it's moving way down into the southern Deccan. And in this particular point, he uses Bankapur as his headquarters, while he sends several commanders further south to do some more conquering. This particular monument is a spectacular Chalukya temple, which he does not destroy, although that is what the contemporary chronicler, Firishta, Muhammad Qasim Firishta, tells us what happened. What actually happened was he transformed it into a mosque. And this is extremely unusual. This is the only case that I'm aware of in all of India where a temple is actually transformed into a mosque. It's very unusual to have this happen. And so I wanted to know how he did it as well as why he did it. I went down there, and one of the evidence we have of this is a plan that was made in 1885 by a British architect, Henry Cousins. And when he got there, he drew this plan. I put in these red lines, because the red lines indicate the outer edge of the original temple. It had been a symmetrical kind of star-shaped phenomenon. What Ali did is he pushed out the walls to make a Qibla wall on the western side, because the temple was already facing Mecca, fortuitously. Mecca is right there to the west. Okay, he puts 3 pillars here, 3 pillars up there in the northwest, in the southwest, and then he builds up. So he has a straight Qibla wall on the western side. He puts a mihrab right in the middle of the passageway leading between this huge mandapa. I mean, it's this large reception hall is what it is. Very large, spacious, which would accommodate, Friday prayers. So that what we have today, that's what it did look like in Ali's day. So he completed it now. He's built the southwest and the northwest corners in. He's put his mihrab in. And if we look at the temple today, this is what we see. The mihrab has been taken out. It was there in 1885 because Cousins talks about it. It's been taken out, but otherwise, the temple is preserved in exactly its original form. Here you see the ceiling, as well as some of those spectacular columns I've talked about before. Clearly, Ali is interested in preserving the aesthetic feel of this temple, in much the way that Mehmed the Conqueror preserved the Byzantine feel of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. He doesn't destroy the place; he simply tweaks it, and comes up with a monument which is analogous, I would argue, to what Ali is doing in the case of this mosque or temple. Now, here's a photograph that Cousins took in 1885, and you can see this southwestern corner. It come way out here, and then that's the Qibla wall on the far left. It had already caved in a bit at that time. So, and this is what it looks like today, taken from that same southwestern perspective, where this has all been restored by the ASI. The Archaeological Survey of India is very much interested in kind of restoring monuments to what they feel were their, especially if they're Hindu monuments, to what they were in their original day. There's a whole other story about that. But I took this in 2010. So that's a second case of kind of revival of Chalukya memory by Bijapur. A third case is even more interesting. Here we are in Kalyana. Kalyana was the capital of the Chalukyas 1,000 years ago. What you're looking at here is not Chalukya. These are battlements and bastions that are built in the 15th to 16th century by both the Bahmani and the Bijapur or Adil Shahi period. But what's fascinating is that fort you saw just a second ago is actually at the top of the only hill in Kalyana. And at the top of the hill, you go in that fort, and you're going to go through several walls and circuits of battlements. And at the topmost part of the fort, you find this extraordinary palace called the Raj Mahal. And we know about it because there's an inscription, there's a Persian inscription right here to the right, which tells you it was built in the period of Ibrahim II in 16-something, late 1600s, early 1600s. And we're now looking north into the arched openings that take us into the interior of the Raj Mahal. This is the palace for the Sultan. And now we're inside that palace. These are very Persianate forms, no surprises here. The vaulting is very characteristic of 17th century Iranian. So is the ceiling. You see the stucco, the painted stucco ceiling. And so we're going to go back outside now, looking at it. Now we're going to turn to the left, and we can see there's a right angle to the left, another arched opening on the far left. And if we look into that arched opening, this is what we see. A Chalukya temple in situ. It's been built into the fabric of an Adil Shahi palace. They haven't destroyed it. It hasn't been moved there as the king of Vijayanagara moved that tank into his capital city. What they've done is the reverse. They've built their own palace around this temple. And not only that, but there is a passageway that used to lead from that temple to the heart of the Raj Mahal. It's right there. That guy is standing in front of it. There's an opening, but the opening does not go past, it doesn't go all the way through anymore. It's been blocked off. But if you're standing outside the doorway to the temple, you can see right here, kind of ghostly make it out, where the arched opening had been. This means Even though you've got the palace here, you've got the temple here, and you have a mosque on the other side. There is no passageway connecting palace and mosque. But there was a passageway connecting temple and palace. And that used to be here. So what is going on here? What is happening with respect to the use or the reuse of these monuments? I want to wind all this up by suggesting that there are different ways of thinking about reuse. And I know that architectural historians have been writing a lot recently about the whole phenomenon of reuse. One purpose of reusing someone else's monuments is simply for structural purposes only, right? I mean, you find this beautiful column, and it happens to be made of very hard masonry, marble or whatever it may be. Why not just use it? And many times it's plastered over, so clearly the builders are not trying to show it off for any reason. They're simply using it because it's going to hold up that structure. And there's lots of that going on. In every culture you find reuse for structural purposes. I can give you many examples of that. And we saw plenty of examples of that. Another use or purpose of a reuse is to take something as a trophy, to humiliate. And there are lots of examples in India of this. Before, I talked earlier about the endemic warfare between the Chalukyas and the Cholas. They're arch enemies in the Tamil country to the south. They used to attack each other's capitals, and if successful, they would seize the icon, the image of the god that was central to the polity of the enemy state, and take that and park it in their own palace as a trophy, in order to humiliate the enemy and to visibly show that we've won the war. And not only have we won the war, we've humiliated the enemy by seizing their icon and taking it home. And this kind of thing happens throughout world history, of course. Nothing unique about India. And then the other thing, but there's another use of trophies, and that is to revive. And I would argue that here we find a purpose exactly opposite of humiliation. Now you're trying to revive with an attempt to emulate, not humiliate. The Chalukyas, after all, had been dead for 500 years. There's no reason to humiliate them. Quite the contrary. I mean, they're not going to pose any threat to anyone. They've been out of business for 5 centuries. But reviving the memory of this very prestigious and illustrious empire, which everyone knows was there because the temples are still around, the tanks are still around, the sculptures everywhere, the records are still there, the Sanskrit, the Kannada writings are still there, texts that were written in the Chalukya age are also surviving and read. We know all that's happening. So the memory is there, and what now has to happen is to activate that memory and bring it back to life architecturally. And what I'm arguing is that I think this is happening, and it's happening among both Hindus and Muslims, but not all the Muslims. It's the Deccans. It's those who have been there much longer and are not like Mahmud Gawan looking over his shoulder to Central Asia. They are very much part of, they see themselves as part of the Indian soil, and they are literally connecting themselves with a particular imperial past that is local. Above all, it's local. It's indigenous. 500 years is about right, because it takes 500 years for people to. I mean, what you're seeing here is the chapel in Aachen, northern France, of Charlemagne. I can see Susan is smiling in recognition. Well, what's happening here is that Charlemagne, significantly, 400 or 500 years after Rome has gone down the drain, takes Roman pillars and brings them up from Italy and plants them in his own capital, and hence we have the so-called Holy Roman Empire. Well, one of the things that makes us Roman is obviously those very same pillars. And I want to close with a thought that this is a theme which is obviously not confined to India. It's a theme which we're going to find probably anywhere in the world, but it's more than coincidental to me, at least, that it takes about 400 or 500 years of time to go by for this memory to be activated. I mean, we have the Chalukyas were virtually forgotten during the 12th, 13th, the 14th, and even the early 15th century. By the 16th century, this memory is activated in different ways and for slightly different purposes, but it's absolutely attested by the material evidence. So my purpose this afternoon was simply to suggest some of the ways that this material evidence can be used by not just art historians, but by historians. And that's my kind of final pitch, that we need to talk about history and art history in not only the same book, but the same paragraph, and move from there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.